The sky over Tereth Prime was deep red with streaks of gold, and the wind whispered through the tall black trees, as if warning all living things to stay silent and still as the dropship hovered above the jungle canopy. A man named Jace stood near the edge of the metal ramp, his eyes focused, his breath calm, his mind ready for what waited below, because he had been told this place was death itself. And no human had ever walked there and lived. They called it the Apex Zone, where the strongest beast on the planet ruled with claws like blades and a roar that cracked stone. The mortal, it was named, and even alien armies refused to go near its hunting ground, unless they had no choice. Only one mission had ever come back alive, and that man had lost half his body and all his mind, and yet now they dropped Jace here, not to kill, not to fight, but simply to observe, to survive for 3 days, to prove humans could walk among monsters without fear. The ramp opened, and warm wind hit Jace's face as he stepped into the thick green air below. His boots touched the mossy ground, and the ship pulled away, leaving him alone in the wild, where the leaves dripped strange glowing liquid, and the shadows moved without light. He checked his small pack. He had food, water, a heat blade, a scanner, and an old harmonica, and nothing else. Far above, in the dark branches of a silent tree, another set of eyes watched, not beast eyes, but bright alien eyes, full of judgment and doubt. A girl named Vela crouched with her breathing slowed, her skin marked with tribal lines, and her long braid tight. She had heard about humans, had been told they were loud, messy, violent, greedy creatures that burned forests and shot first and asked later, and she came here not to help him, but to watch him. Jace walked slow, letting the jungle breathe around him. He touched the plants with care and made small sounds of wonder. When strange bugs crawled over his hand, he found a stream and took only a sip, careful not to stir the water. And when he saw a group of thornbacks nesting nearby, he backed away without making a sound. Vela frowned. This was not how humans acted, or so she believed. As night came, he built a simple shelter using long leaves and vine rope, and tied it to 2 strong trees. Then he sat near the small fire he made, and pulled out his harmonica, and played a soft tune, something old, something earthborn, something gentle, and it floated through the jungle air like a lullaby. Even Vela felt her chest grow still at the sound. But the peace broke when the ground gave a soft tremble, and the air seemed to shake. The sound came from deep in the jungle. A howl, not like a wolf but like thunder being ripped apart. A cry that made birds flee and insects go silent. It was the mortal. It was hunting, and it was close. Vela's heart pounded. She moved higher in the tree, but kept her eyes on the human. She wanted to see fear in him, to see panic, but Jace only stood slowly and picked up his scanner. He looked toward the trees and waited. From the shadows came movement, a sudden shift in leaves. Then silence, then another tremble, then silence again. The fire cracked once and died down a little, and Jace stepped back near his shelter. Not running, not shaking, just watching, Vela thought. He was mad. She gripped her weapon tighter, ready to run. Because no one faced the mortal and lived, not even her strongest warriors, not even the bravest among them. Then it happened behind the trees. Just past the firelight, something massive moved, something heavy. Its shape hidden, but its breath loud and slow, like steam through stone. The beast was there. Watching, Jace didn't raise his blade. He didn't light his flare. He simply sat down near the dying fire and looked into the trees. With steady eyes, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a piece of dried meat, and gently tossed it near the edge of the light. Then he whispered softly, though the words were lost in the wind. The beast didn't come closer, but didn't leave either. It stayed just beyond the trees, silent, breathing deep, waiting. Vela could not understand it. The mortal should have attacked, should have charged, should have torn the human apart, but it didn't. And as the firelight danced and shadows grew long, she felt a chill, not from fear but from something else, something like doubt. Jace leaned back and looked up at the stars through the open leaves above, and as he played a low note on his harmonica again, the sound slipped through the jungle and touched something in the dark. Vela blinked, unsure of what she was feeling, because this was not what she expected, and the mortal had not killed him yet. She stayed hidden, but she whispered one word to herself. As the fire faded and the jungle held its breath, and the beast stayed just out of reach, morning came slowly on Tereth Prime. As soft gold light filtered through thick green leaves, the jungle seemed to hold its breath while the birds sang low, and the wind passed without a sound. Jace opened his eyes to the soft touch of light across his face and the scent of wild blossoms in the air. He stretched his arms slowly, careful not to disturb anything nearby, and sat up with calm, steady movements. His shelter had held through the night, and he was still alive. No tracks, no blood, no sign of the mortal. But something had been close, something big, something ancient and curious. High above him, in a thick branch, Vela crouched with sharp eyes and, touching his tight hands. She had not slept. Her mind had spun all night, trying to understand what she had seen or not seen. The mortal had stood there breathing heavy just beyond the trees. It had watched the human. It had listened to his strange, soft music. And then it had left without killing, without roaring, without tearing flesh or bone. That made no sense. No stories from her people said anything like this. No record showed the beast ever walking away from prey. And yet the human still breathed below, packed his gear with quiet grace, moving with a kind of ease found in someone who did not believe the world owed him safety. He ate a small meal of dried roots and fruit, and then poured a bit of water onto the ground, as if giving thanks to the jungle itself. Then he walked. He didn't follow a map, didn't scan a path. He followed the wind and the calls of far birds, his steps soft and deliberate, like he didn't want the forest to notice him. Vela followed from above, moving through the trees like a whisper, her training perfect, her motion silent, but her mind raced. Why didn't he cut down trees? Why didn't he leave behind trash? Why did he smile at a beetle that crawled across his boot and help a tiny plant grow straight again? Humans were loud, greedy, wasteful. That was what she was told, what she believed, what all her people believed, and now her own eyes were turning against her. Herdress stopped at a fallen tree, where a family of glow frogs had made their home. He bent low to watch them. His scanner blinked red warning of toxin levels, but he only laughed softly and backed away, leaving the frogs untouched. As he turned, he noticed a flash of movement in the corner of his eye. Not a beast, not a bird, something else, something with soft blue skin and quick breath, and then it was gone. He said nothing, but he smiled and kept walking, as if he didn't want to scare the jungle's secrets away. Vela froze behind a vine wall, her heart pounding. Had he seen her? Was he pretending not to? Had he set a trap, or did he really want no harm? She didn't understand him, and that made her feel something dangerous, something like curiosity. Near a shallow stream, Jace sat down and played his harmonica again, low and smooth, like a wind sighing through tall grass. The sound made a herd of small feather lizards pause and gather around him, their heads tilted as if the music meant something, their tails swaying slow and gentle. Vela saw this and felt a strange tightness in her chest. No warrior in her tribe, no elder, no priest, had ever stood this calm among the jungle's creatures. No one had ever made them gather instead of scatter on. Yet here he was alone, unwelcome, unarmed, and still the world moved gently around him. Suddenly, a sound came from deep behind the trees, a sharp high screech followed by the crash of breaking branches. Something was coming fast, something wild and angry. Just stood quickly, eyes narrowing as his hand moved to the heat blade at his hip, but he did not draw it. He waited and listened, and when the first creature broke through the trees, he stepped back, but not away. It was not the mortal, it was something smaller, but still deadly. Jungle hunters, long-bodied with fangs, curved like scythes, and black hides that shimmered with poison. They had found him. 3 of them, mouths open, tails lashing, eyes locked on their prey. Jace raised one hand slowly and reached into his pack. He pulled out dried meat and tossed it far to the side. The smell caught their attention, but they did not move. Then he did something Vela could not believe. He dropped to one knee and bowed his head like offering himself. The hunters crept closer, fangs ready, bodies low. Then one sniffed him one more step. Then another. Then it turned and walked toward the meat. The others followed, and after a long tense moment, they all vanished into the trees. Vela could not breathe. What kind of human does that? What kind of creature meets death with silence and kindness and still lives? Jace stood, brushed dirt from his knee, and looked up into the trees. Straight into her eyes. Bella froze, caught. She expected him to yell or demand or threaten, but he simply raised one hand, palm open, then said to soft words, "You okay?" She didn't answer, not with words. Not with weapons, not with fear. She stepped back into the shadows and ran her thoughts, burning her heart racing behind her. The trees parted, and 2 huge golden eyes opened in the mist. The mortal had returned. The mist curled around the trees like silver breath, and the jungle held its voice in silence as Jace stood still near the water's edge. His eyes locked with the 2 golden orbs glowing from the dark behind the vines. They were not small, they were not soft, they belonged to the mortal, the apex beast of Tarith Prime. The one thing all creatures feared, the one thing even the jungle respected. It stepped forward slowly, with no rush, no fear, no warning. Its head was like a hammer carved from black stone, and its horns swept backward in long curves. Its body moved like a shadow of mountains, and its feet made no sound on the earth, though the ground quivered with each step. The trees leaned back, and the light bent through the air, as if afraid to touch its height. Jace stayed still, not frozen, not stiff, but calm and rooted like the trees around him. His hands at his side, no weapon raised, no sign of fear on his face, only quiet, steady eyes, watching every move of the giant before him. In the high branches, Vela watched from behind a thick wall of moss, her fingers tight on the bark. Her breath caught in her chest. She had seen what the mortal did to trespassers. It tore them apart before they could scream. It crushed armored beasts. With one step, it shattered machines with one bite, and yet here it was, facing a lone human who did nothing but breathe. The mortal stopped 2 steps away, its hot breath steaming the air. Between them, its claws larger than Jace's head, its eyes glowing like twin suns behind smoke, and yet it did not growl. It did not charge, it simply looked at him like it was reading something not on his body but in his. Soldius slowly lowered himself to one knee, his head bowed, and his palms opened to the ground. He whispered something soft, something lost in the wind, and the mortal leaned closer. Its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the human's scent, its claw lifted and touched the earth beside. Jace not on him, not near him, just beside, as if marking the space between them, as something sacred. Vela had never seen anything like this, not in any scroll, not in any tale, not in any dream. Even her people who lived for centuries in this jungle had never told of the mortal pausing, had never said it, listened, had never dared imagine it could understand, but this one did. It blinked once, and then turned its massive body, slowly walked past Jace, and into the trees, not fast, not in fear, just like a king leaving his throne, knowing none would question. His right. Jace lifted his head, and looked at the place where the beast had vanished, then looked up into the trees and locked eyes with Vela again. This time he said nothing, and neither did she, but her hand loosened on the branch and her breath returned, and for the first time since watching him, she felt something colder than fear, and sharper than anger. She dropped to the ground when the silence grew too heavy, and stepped into the open, where Jace still knelt near the water. She kept her weapon down but her eyes up, sharp and wary, her voice low and tight, as she asked what he had done. How he had tricked the beast, what kind of tech he carried, what lies he told. Jace smiled and shook his head, said he used no trick, no device, no lie, only respect and calm, and trust. Vela didn't believe him, couldn't believe him. Everything she knew, everything she trained for, everything her people feared, said this was impossible, said the beast should have killed him, should have ripped him apart for breathing the same air. She walked around him, circling, looking for signs of implants or hidden shields or scent blockers, but she found nothing, only a simple man with soft eyes and steady breath, a man who had fed a predator instead of fighting it, a man who had faced the king of death and lived with no scar. She stepped close, and asked him again why the mortal didn't kill him, and he only said maybe it felt something in him, something peaceful, maybe it had grown tired of being feared. Vela laughed once, but it was dry and short and bitter. She turned away and said he was either a liar or a fool, but part of her voice cracked, and she hated that. Jace walked past her, and pointed to a low bush where glowing fruit grew. He picked one and handed it to her without a word. She didn't take it at first, but then she did, and when their hands touched, she flinched, not from fear, but from something else, something warm and strange. That night they shared the fruit by the fire, and the wind moved gently through the leaves, as if curious to and from the shadows in the trees. Another pair of golden eyes blinked, smaller than before, gentler than before. The mortal had not come alone. The fire cracked low under a blanket of green mist as the jungle swayed gently with the breath of the planet, and Vela sat near the edge of the camp, her fingers curled around the glowing fruit the human had given her, but she had not taken a bite. She watched him closely, watched how he leaned against a tree with his eyes half closed, and the harmonica resting on his lap, his body calm as if he belonged here, as if the jungle welcomed him, as if the beast that ruled this world had left him a throne. She hated that thought, hated how he made her question everything she had been taught, everything her elders had warned her about humans, about their hunger, about their lies, about their noise. She had seen their cities on distant moons, with towers that touched the sky and ships that screamed through stars, and now here was one of them sitting in silence, playing music for flowers and birds and monsters alike. Jace opened his eyes slowly and smiled at her without speaking, his face soft like the breeze, his hands resting on his knees like he had no reason to fear anything around him. And maybe he didn't, maybe the jungle had already accepted him, maybe the mortal had already claimed him as one of its own. Vela stood and walked over her boots, pressing softly into the moss, her voice sharp, as she asked him if he had some hidden weapon, some cloaking field, some toxin the beast had smelled that kept it away, and he shook his head slowly and said no, only truth and calm. She crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes, and told him the mortal had once destroyed a hover tank with a single swipe, had cracked the hull of a battle cruiser, had chewed through plasma steel like bark, and yet it had sniffed him and walked away. She asked again why, and he said maybe it saw him as no threat, or maybe it saw him as something else. That answer made her stomach twist. She turned and stormed away into the trees, not far, just enough to breathe without him near, and sat under a vine-covered stone. The air smelled of wet earth, and flower smoke, and her mind raced with images of the beast and the human standing together, like to myths from different worlds. She remembered the stories her mother told her, of the Mortho, of its rage, of its revenge, of how it once destroyed a whole outpost, because one hunter wounded its mate. She remembered how no one ever found the bodies, how the trees grew darker in that place, and how nothing ever dared to enter Agonand. Now this human with no armor, no army, no name that mattered, had touched its world and lived. The forest whispered, and she heard footsteps, soft and slow, and she knew it was him. Without looking, he came and sat on a fallen log nearby, not close, but not far either. He didn't speak, just played a few soft notes on his harmonica, and let the music carry between them, like a bridge made of sand. Vela sighed and finally bit the fruit. It was warm, sweet, with a hint of spice, and it made her chest feel heavy, and her eyes sting, for reasons she didn't understand. She looked at him, and asked if he really thought peace was possible, with something like the Morthal. And he nodded, said peace was not something given, it was something earned. Something offered without force. She said, that kind of talk would get him killed, and he said maybe, but it would be his choice that made her quieter. Later that night, while the moon floated high, and the jungle glowed in patches of light, something rustled near the edge of the clearing. Jace stood slowly, and raised a hand, not in warning, but in greeting, and from the trees came a shape, not large, not heavy, but cautious, and Lute was the young one, the smaller Morthal, the child of the beast that had spared him. Its scales softer, its horns not yet fully curved, its eyes wide. With curiosity and calm, it stepped into the light and sniffed the air, and Vela reached for her blade, but froze when Jace whispered, no. He knelt and opened his hand palm up, and the creature stepped closer, step by step, until its nose touched his fingers, and it let out a soft clicking sound, like purring stone, and then lowered itself beside the fire, its head resting near his knee, its body folding into the earth, like it had done this before, like it had waited for this. Vela could not move. Her mind screamed, but her body stayed still, her heart beating like drums in a storm, and she whispered to herself, what is he? Who is he? Why does the jungle love him? Jace looked at her across the fire and said softly, come closer, it's safe, and she shook her head, but her feet betrayed her, and took one step then another, until she stood just outside the circle of warmth. The young Morthal turned its head and looked at her, and she looked back, and for a moment the world held no danger, no fear, just a stillness that wrapped around all three of them, and in that silence she felt something inside her shift, something ancient, something true. The fire burned low with soft orange light, as the jungle darkened, and the stars above blinked like quiet eyes, watching from the sky. The young Morthal lay beside Jace, its massive body curled in the moss, its breath slow and even, like it had always belonged there, and Jace sat with his legs crossed, one hand resting gently on the creature's scaled head, while his other hand held the harmonica, waiting. Vela stood still near the edge of the clearing, her heart thudding with something that felt too big for her chest, fear, confusion, or maybe all three. She had seen warriors bowed before the elders, but never before a beast. She had seen beasts break cages, but never choose to stay near a human. With no chains she stepped closer, one foot then another, until the light touched her skin, and the young Morthal lifted its head slowly and looked at her, eyes glowing but soft and quiet. It didn't growl, it didn't bare its teeth, it just watched her like it wanted to know her scent, her shape. Her soul just looked up and gave a small nod, like everything was okay, like nothing was strange or wrong, and he patted the ground beside him, as if inviting her to sit near the deadliest creature in the known galaxy, like it was just a campfire companion. Didn't sit, not yet, but she knelt and looked into the creature's eyes, trying to see rage or hunger or danger, but finding none, only the calm of a storm that had already passed. She asked Jace what he had done, what spell he had cast, what chemical he had used, and he only smiled and said none of those things. Said maybe kindness was louder than fear, if you let it speak long enough. She didn't know what to say, because her people had tried to kill. The Morthal had sent hunters and weapons and prayers and still failed, and now here was a man with nothing but quiet hands and a steady voice taming what could not be tamed. The young beast nudged Jace's arm gently, and he laughed, a sound so soft and real that it made Vela's throat tighten. And the creature moved closer to him, placing its head in his lap like a dog seeking warmth, and Vela whispered, this is not real, this cannot be. Rial just looked at her and asked why not, asked why it was so hard to believe something powerful could also be gentle, something feared could also choose peace. She said power was never gentle, that's why it ruled, and he said maybe true power didn't need to crush things to prove itself. Maybe it just needed to be understood. She had no answer for that's. The fire faded, and the jungle sighed. The young Morthal stood and turned its head toward the deeper woods, letting out a low growl, not angry, but alert, and Jace stood to brushing dirt from his legs, and grabbing his pack, Vela followed his gaze and saw movement between the trees, more creatures, not mortal, not peaceful, not curious hunters. Not hers, not friendly, armed with bone knives and skin armor, eyes red from night serum. These were poachers from the southern tribes who killed anything rare for coin and glory. They had heard of the mortal youngling, maybe tracked it, maybe smelled its trail. Jace stepped between the fire and the shadows, raising one hand and lowering his voice, asking them to stop, asking them not to hurt the creature, saying it was not a threat, saying he would go with them if they let the beasts go. Them poachers laughed a low dry sound, and one of them raised his rifle, a weapon older than Jace, but still deadly, and aimed it at the creature's eye. Vela shouted, "No," and drew her blade, stepping in front of the beast, but too slow, too late. The trigger clicked, and the shot fired, and everything froze in a blink, but the blast never hit the shot, never landed, because the elder mortal had returned. It came from the trees like a thunderclap, with eyes blazing like suns, and its roar shattered branches and tore the silence into pieces. It stood tall above them all, its shadow covering the camp, its breath, fire and ice, and its rage a storm that even the stars could feel. The poachers fell back, some dropped their weapons, one tried to run, but roots from the jungle curled around his legs and held him tight, as if the world itself was on the beast's side. The young mortal cried out, and ran to the larger one, pressing his head into the thick armored chest, and the elder placed one massive claw over it, like a shield, and then looked at Jas, not with hate, not with fury, but with something else. A recognition. Jas stepped forward slowly, no weapon, no threat, and bowed his head low, his voice barely more than a whisper, as he thanked the creature for not killing them, for showing mercy. And Vela stood beside him, not sure what she believed anymore, but knowing one thing, with full certainty, this human had changed something big, something old, and the jungle knew it. The camp sat in silence. After the roar faded, the kind of silence that wraps around the skin like cold mist, the kind that holds its breath even after the danger passes. The poachers had run or dropped where they stood, one still tangled in roots, too afraid to speak, too stunned to fight. And the elder mortal towered over them, all eyes like fire glowing with power, but not. Rajesh stood between the beast and the girl, his body calm, his voice steady, as he whispered to the wind that no harm would come from him, not to the youngling, not to the jungle, not to anything that did not raise a weapon first. He knelt again in the dirt, palms open toward the ground, and bowed low, and the elder beast moved closer until its shadow swallowed him. Vela watched this with wide eyes, her knees weak, her thoughts loud, her heart louder. She had seen this beast in drawings, old ones carved into temple walls, showing fire and bones, and war, never calm, never still, never this. And yet here it stood, touching the human's shoulder with the back of its claw, like an elder passing a blessing, like a king naming an heir. The young mortal whimpered low, and pressed itself into the side of the great beast, and the elder gave a deep slow breath, like a mountain sighing, then turned its head toward the girl, and stared with eyes that saw too much, saw her doubt, saw her fear, saw her soul. She stepped forward slowly, her blade lowered, her voice shaking as she spoke words in her native tongue, words older than the jungle itself. She said, "Forgive Ushi." Said, "We never knew." She said, "We never tried to understand Hunda." The beast blinked once, and turned away and disappeared into the trees with its child walking beside it, with no fear, with no chains, with no reason to look back. Jay stood again, dusted off his hands, and turned to face her, his eyes tired but peaceful, his body still shaking a little from the power that had just stood over him, but his heart steady and full. And Vela met his gaze, and did something she never thought she would do. She bowed, not as a warrior, not as a scout, not as a daughter of the jungle, but as someone who had seen something sacred, and knew she could never unsee it. "Said you were right," she said. "I believe you now." Just smiled, the kind of smile that carries no pride, only relief, and nodded once, and said, "Thank you." Not loud, not proud, just soft, like the trees. They sat by the fire in silence, while the jungle woke again. Birds singing, leaves rustling, creatures moving with cautious joy, the world returning to motion after a miracle had passed. Later, they walked back toward her tribe, her people waiting beyond the river, behind stone walls and moss gates, where stories had been carved in fear and passed down in blood and silence. She told him the truth before they crossed, that they would not accept him, that they might try to stop him, or worse. And he said he understood, but he had to try us. They crossed the river. The guards raised their spears, and the elders stepped forward, their faces hard, their eyes sharp as knives. They asked why she had brought him, why she walked beside him, why she wore no shame and no scars. And she looked them in the eyes, and told them what she saw, what the beast had done, what the jungle had allowed. They laughed at first, not cruel but nervous, because fear does not leave Easy, it hides deep in bones and memories. They asked for proof, for signs, and then the jungle gave it. Young Morthel stepped into the clearing behind them, slow and quiet, not hiding, not hunting. Just present, and beside it, walked the elder beast, taller than the trees, glowing with the power of old legends, and nothing made a sound. The elders dropped to one knee. The guards let their weapons fall, and the children, watching from the gate, ran back to tell the tale of the beasts who walked without rage, and the human who brought peace, with no army, no war, no trick. Jace looked at Vela, and she looked back, and for the first time since she was small, she smiled with no fear and no mask, and said, maybe the stars were wrong about your kind, maybe. The jungle was waiting for someone like you all along, and the beasts turned back into the trees, not chased, not followed, just remembered forever, in the breath of the leaves and the songs of the roots and the eyes of the world that had seen something new. The gates of the alien village creaked open, as the jungle behind them whispered stories into the wind, stories of beasts that did not kill, stories of humans who did not conquer, stories that would live in the roots and the stone and the stars forever. Jace walked beside Vela through the moss-covered paths, where eyes peeked from behind trees, and old warriors held their breath, and young children stepped forward with wonder in their hearts and questions in their hands. No one spoke at first, not the elders, not the guards, not the priestess, who once warned that the jungle would swallow the human whole and spit out his bones instead. They watched as he passed, not with fear, not with hate, but with something older than those. Something deep led him to the center of the village, where the stone circle marked the place of judgment and memory, where the voices of the past echoed in silence, carved into the ground and the trees and the sky. She turned to the crowd and raised her voice strong and clear and steady, as the beasts who had vanished into the trees. She said, I was wrong. She said, we were wrong. She said, the jungle has spoken, and it did not roar. The elders stepped forward, robes heavy with age and eyes sharp with years, and they looked at the human, not as prey, not as danger, but as mystery and power, and they asked her why they should listen, why they should trust, why they should forget the fires of the past. And then the earth trembled, not with violence, but with life, as the young Morthel stepped through the trees again, not alone, but beside the human, not afraid but proud, its golden eyes scanning the faces, its breath calm, its body still. And in that moment all arguments fell to the ground like leaves in wind. The oldest elder dropped to one knee, not in weakness but in surrender, and the others followed, not to Jace, not to the beast, but to the truth. They could no longer deny the jungle had chosen later. As night wrapped the village in soft blue light, and the stars stretched like rivers above them, the people gathered in a great circle, sharing fruit and fire and story, and Jace sat with Vela near the edge, his harmonica in hand, and his heart full but quiet. She asked him what he would do next, if he would return to his people to tell them what happened, to bring others, and he shook his head and said, no, not yet, maybe never, maybe. This was not something to be taken, only something to be trusted and protected. She smiled and said, maybe you are more jungle than star. Now he laughed and said, maybe that is why the beast did not fear me. The young Morthel curled near the fire, resting with slow breath, its tail twitching gently like it dreamed of wide rivers and deep skies, and the children crept close to touch its scales and hear its soft sounds, and the old stories began to fade, replaced by new ones of peace, of balance, of a human who walked without weapons and left no scar. Days passed, and then weeks, and word spread across planets, across systems, across borders, that had never known peace, that the jungle no longer wept, that the beasts no longer hunted without thought, that a man with no rank, no crown, no weapon, had done what armies failed to do. The village elders named Vela the new voice of the jungle, the one who would speak for the beasts and the trees, and she asked Jace to stand beside her, not behind, not above, not as leader, but as equal. And he did. They planted trees together, where blood had once spilled, and carved new signs into the old stones, not in warning, but in welcome. And travelers from far worlds came, not to conquer, not to burn, but to learn, because when they asked who taught the beasts to trust, who tamed the wild, who changed the fate of the forgotten world, the answer was always the same. He did. The human with no armor, the man who bowed to the beast, the stranger who gave his last fruit to a girl who once watched from the shadows. Even the stars blinked slower when they passed over Terith Prime now, and the wind carried music that came from no instrument, only the leaves and the breath and the memory of something once feared, now loved, and far beyond the trees, where no one watched, the elder Morthel stood on a high cliff with its child and looked down on the world it had ruled alone for so long, and gave a low, soft growl, not of warning, not of sorrow, but of peace, a peace born not from blades but from belief.